Dom from the Logos Project. Thank you for joining me very much, sir. This is our second conversation. We started out on your channel discussing the meaning crisis, and we're going to keep it going today. So thank you for joining me, man. You're very welcome.
Thanks, Mahon. It's great to be on your channel. Yeah, that was a great conversation we had over on my channel, a kind of continuation of the one we had in Rome where we bumped into each other. So I'm excited to keep it going, really.
Yes, 100%, man. That was kind of where we got to in the last conversation, was the topic of like the Catholic response to modernity in some sense. I was suggesting that
Yeah,
the next thing is almost like a folding in of modernity, the Enlightenment, scientific
yeah,
revolution in some way into the great tradition, similar to what Aquinas did in the medieval period with the pagan philosophers, where he brought, Aristotle, Neoplatonic thought within Christianity, that there's now a challenge for that to happen. And, quite
yeah.
a few thinkers. So hopefully that's what we'll get to. But maybe starting off, I mean, like, what do you think modernity is? Maybe like what does it mean to you, and like what do you think
Yeah.
about when you hear that word?
Yeah. Well, just as a very brief caveat, when it comes to like how I understand modernity and how I understand even the Catholic response, I'm very much like a very excited amateur. So don't quote me,
Me too, to
on
be
my
fair.
channel. Yeah, on my channel, I interview the actual experts, right? And but to me, modernity really is the product of the disintegration of the Catholic form, right? It's really the rise of classical liberalism, which is a kind of alternative view of the world that replaced the view of Christendom, the view of the church. And so it has all of these presuppositions. It has a way of interpreting reality that is actually totalizing, I think. So it's not just like we were talking about this off air. It's not just one of the other heresies that kind of branches off and that gets dealt with, but within Christendom, it's almost like a repudiation and
Mm,
apostasy of the whole, that results from the
yeah.
fracturing, the many fracturings. So a lot of people give intellectual genealogies, and those are always to some extent inadequate, right? And a bit arbitrary because something always has something that caused it before it. So you can go back to Adam and Eve, basically, right? But
Yeah.
so I would really say it's a lot of times people point to nominalism, William of Ockham. Some people will also
Mm,
point to Duns Scotus. There have been some recent Catholic theologians who have pushed back on that narrative, but honestly, I tend to agree that Scotus kind of goes in a direction that leads to Occam eventually, but people disagree about that. But long story short, I think that you could summarize it, to put it in simplistic terms for myself, really, in a view of God that absolutizes his power, right? That Schindler talks about
mm,
this in one of his books. It's a kind of inversion of potency over actuality. And it starts with hypothetical scenarios when it comes to God's power. Could God do this? Could God do that? And what happens then is that theologizing and philosophizing starts to begin, it begins on the premise of abstract hypotheses, of potential things, as opposed to actual things. And so we move away from reality and we start to potentialize everything. And that has a kind of downstream effect where the actuality of God becomes secondary. And then you have divisions within Christendom. Everything is within a competitive framework. The Protestant Reformation kind of draws this out, and the fight with the Catholic Church in terms of faith and works, and how merit works, and money's involved, and corruption, and things like that. And so eventually,
mm.
it creates these rifts that then create a kind of stage for what's been called the wars of religion. But really, there's a great book that I don't know if you've heard of before. It's by William Cavanaugh. It's called the Myth of Religious Violence. It's really a fascinating book because he calls into question um, the way in which we use the terms, specifically the term religion. The way us modern people use this term religion is actually not the way in which it was used in the past. It's a novelty. It's a creation. It's an ideological creation, and it comes always
Yeah.
alongside its Siamese twin, the secular. And this secular religious divide is a modern construction that actually
Yes.
it's ideological. It actually creates conflict. That's the argument of the book by Kavanaugh, is that this creation of the category of religion actually creates conflict.
Mm.
When I first heard that, I was like, what in the world is he talking about? But if you really think about it, you go back to the 14th century and you talk to someone in the Far East and you ask them what religion they are, they'll look at you like you don't, like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no such thing as religion.
Mm.
When they lived the Buddhist values, these were social, political, structural values of their life. You ask Thomas Aquinas how many religions there are, he'd probably say 7, 8, 9, because he's talking about the Benedictines, the Dominicans, the Franciscans. He's not talking about Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, right? We've kind of abstracted religion and we've essentialized it in an ahistorical kind of way, and then we've set them all side by side, right? And then we've given them, we've made them into things that individuals can choose, right? So anyway, I'm
Yeah,
rambling, but
like
the
a
point though
menu.
is, I think, yeah, like a menu, right? But what that enshrines is this potential, this power to choose, and the individual, a kind of autonomy that is radical, that sees the world in a mechanistic way. And so, yeah, so people draw it back to William of Ockham, and through the Reformation, Christendom starts to splinter, and we have to create a kind of neutral space to appease people, talk about articles of peace. You can have your religion, you can have your religion. And what happens is that humanity continues to fracture, and this neutral space becomes a neutralizing space, a neutralizing of a common
Mm.
good, a common value. And I mean, I think it culminates in the 20th century with the world wars, and many other things, but atheistic humanism. And I think that's the world that we're in, and basically a world without God, because we've repudiated the church and the tradition. That's how I would read modernity. And that sounds kind of apocalyptic, but I don't think there's no hope. I just think it's that bad. So what do you think?
Yeah, and oh man, that's such a good answer. There's so many things there in, like, the idea. I remember DC Schindler said that the freedom of religion precludes the existence of religion. Like, as soon
That's
as
right.
all religions can be free and you can have all of them, you actually have none, because a religion is a metaphysics, a mythology, morality. It's something you live in entirely. Like,
Yeah,
it's your reality. So as soon as there's all realities are equal and you can live in them, there is no reality. They're all,
that's right. Yeah.
subjective or something like that. And so we're in a
Yeah.
real
Yeah.
bind, man. I'm reading Charles Taylor at the moment, Secular
Yeah.
Age. He does a
Yeah.
great genealogy of it, like very detailed.
Yeah.
And this kind of, but he describes it as like the term social imaginary. He uses a
Yes.
Wittgenstein quote that we become
Yeah.
trapped in a picture in a way. So it's almost like this picture of reality that's like, through materialism, through this idea of like a third space almost between religions, probably because of the fracturing of religions. You get this material universe, material causes. We're evolved through unguided processes, and
Hmm.
that we can somehow live without religions, without mythology, without superstition, which is the kind of Enlightenment angle of like we're leaving the darkness into the light of kind of
Yeah.
rationality or reason. That when you fuse all
Hmm.
this together, you get what the social imaginary that he refers to. It's like this background almost of like
Hmm.
thoughts, feelings, models, things that just shape the way that you're looking at. Like, you just have this model of reality that becomes implicit in some sense. It's like, it starts out, because his big question is like, in 1500 it would have been nearly impossible not to believe in God, and now it's nearly
Yeah.
impossible to believe in God. He's like, what happened?
Yeah.
And it's this growth of this kind of social imaginary that increasingly, I think, pushes God into like a deism, like this very
Yeah.
distant,
Yeah.
disconnected thing, particularly to
Absent
preserve the
father.
power of God, like what you
Yeah.
mentioned, like an absent father, but that becomes so distant that it's easy to just cut it off. Like, at some point,
Yeah.
it's like God is like getting further and further away, and then at some point we can just go snip, and it's like, here we go. We have this
Hmm.
perfectly imminent, immediate
Yeah.
world that we're all in. There's just what you see is what you get. It's nominalistic, it's materialistic, it's empirical, and you just have, then the whole point is human flourishing, essentially, like this flat plane of like, we're just
Yes.
meant to progress materially, and then we have to master everything. We have to set up a whole economy in order to feed our desires and try and make us feel
Yeah.
good through material
Yeah.
things, because it turns out that's actually doesn't work that well. And that
Yeah.
this is like the modern situation is this purely immanent world where even the idea of God is like this other, even God as a
Imminent.
supernatural entity in a sense is like
Yeah.
is part of that same worldview. It's like,
Yeah. The transcendent is
it's already gone.
reduced. Yeah.
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 Sorry.
I
But
love.
yeah, I mean,
No. Yeah.
is that landing okay?
Absolutely. Well, everything you were saying reminded me of this. So he's kind of crazy. This is a French philosopher, kind of crazy. His story is very interesting. His name was
Okay.
Auguste
Nice.
Comte. I don't know if you've heard of him, but
Oh, yes. Yeah.
he,
Yeah. I've heard of him.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he had this theory that it was very much a kind of progressive evolutionary view of enlightenment. And he thought that
Yes.
human knowledge began as he called it fetishism, right? And so he's kind of talking about the early
Mm.
religious experience of man, the kind of
Mm-hmm.
making the world something supernatural and not something scientific, so to speak. But the next step
Yeah.
for after fetishism was metaphysics. And metaphysics was kind of like, in
Okay.
his view, rationalizing our fetishism and kind of going beyond it and making it more rational, right? But after
Mm-hmm.
metaphysics was positivism. And positivism was applying
Yes.
pure reason in a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Empirical way, right? So reducing all of the sciences to the kind of positivistic scientific method. So that would include social sciences. It would include, psychology and all these kinds of things. These become the ultimate sciences. Everything is positivistic. There's no metaphysical depth anymore. And so ontology is shirked off as just a kind of
Mm-hmm.
rationalization of our fetishes, if that makes sense. And so Kuntz kind
That's
of
so
basically,
interesting.
isn't that interesting? Yeah. And the influence of Kuntz on our world today is massive. And I didn't realize that until one of my favorite authors pointed it out to me, Henry de Lubac. He kind of wrote a
Yeah.
genealogy of Kunt's ideas. And yeah, so it seems to me that that's another strand, another intellectual genealogy, where Kuntz kind of describes us as progressing towards more and more enlightenment, but it becomes a radically
Yep.
immanent and flattened out world, which then I think
Mm.
creates the crisis that we're in, among other factors. But yeah, so what you said reminded me of him.
Y-
Yeah,
Mm. Yes, so that evolutionary account, I think, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in some sense. That like there's a rupture, because in the traditional world, it's like you progress, you don't really progress, you carry on the tradition. It's like you live up to the standard of the tradition, and then there's this
yeah,
weird rupture, probably around the Renaissance or something, where it's like no, we're going somewhere. Like this is more, we're
hmm,
developing something. There's and you can see this in the 20th century, like the utopian kind of ideals, which is obviously when it
hmm,
collapses to just the world. But this evolutionary, I kind of think of the Enlightenment almost as like an inversion of Plato's cave in a way, because Plato's cave is like the darkness
yeah,
of sensory experience of materialism, and then you leave the cave to have an experience of God. But they
yeah,
turn it around the other way in some sense, like that the cave is filled with all this God stuff, myth, ritual, and then you progress
yeah,
out of that to see the light of reason. And like you can look at the whole of history through that lens in some sense. I know a very well known philosopher I know who's like a great like ancient philosopher or whatever. He described like the Enlightenment as like one of the few times in human history that we started to see the light. And he's like ancient Greece, maybe a little bit, and then you have that, and then
yeah,
like in recent memory, it's like you kind of define history almost as like these moments where we almost just leapt out of God,
yeah,
out of history, out of all these things. And it's like that's the eschatological vision, I think, that's driving so
yeah,
much of it. But it just leads nowhere, obviously. Like, and then their trick is that ontology, as you pointed out, it's like we're
hmm,
not doing ontology or we're not doing metaphysics. So you accept their metaphysics, and then it pulls up the ladder of like there is no metaphysics. It's like you already have a
that's right.
metaphysics, but it's like, but we're not going to do metaphysics. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of tyrannical in a way of like you're just going to say
Yeah,
assume your
exactly.
metaphysics is the final
That's
say on
right.
it.
No, yeah, that's basically Kant's position. He says, metaphysics is a kind of primitive stage in this process, and then he kind of shirks it off and
Yeah.
says positivism is superior. But it's like you're making a metaphysical case here. It's a negative one, but it sure is a metaphysical case, right? And so, I mean, that's definitely the case. You brought up the Renaissance, and I think that this is really
Mm,
important for some of the theologians I really enjoy reading, such as de Lubac. He points to a shift that
okay.
happens in the Renaissance with this kind of this emerging humanism, and what happens between philosophy and theology. I think starts, that genealogy starts in the Renaissance, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to bring up, before I
Yeah.
do, one more character in the Middle Ages that
Okay.
is
Yeah.
oftentimes overlooked. We all talk about William of Ockham, but I think one guy who's really overlooked is a Franciscan. It's always Franciscans, right? I love the Franciscans, but this guy is called Joachim of Fiore, or Flore. Some people spell it differently. But Joachim was a Franciscan abbot, and there was a lot of fighting in the Franciscan order. There was a strand of the Franciscan order that called themselves the Spiritualists, and then the other strand that wanted to stay faithful to Saint Francis and to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope at the time. Uh, Eventually, Bonaventure, interestingly enough, is the one who shows up after there's all this carnage in the Franciscan order and tries to set things right. But the legacy of
Hmm.
Joachim, I would argue, and it's not me arguing this, it's actually Henry de Lubac, um, creates and affects the entire movement of modern philosophy, especially German idealism. And so, to summarize a little bit, Joachim's view is that he argued for a view of history that had three main parts, so to speak, and these are progressive parts. The first part he called the part of the time of the Father. This is the Old Testament. The second time he called the time of the Son. This is the time of the Church. But Joachim foretold and foresaw, so to speak, a third time period called the time of the Holy Spirit. And this would be a kind of a move beyond the earthly structure of the church and its mediation, right, into something that was deracinated from the ecclesio-centric view of tradition and of actuality and of mediation and all that kind of stuff. And so this kind of starts to create a lot of what we see in the nominalist controversy, with the individual being an autonomous, person that has the capacity, the power, the potential to choose and actualize for himself certain things over and against the given, right? The structures
Mm,
of mediation that make up our culture and the form of the church. So I think this is deeply connected. Joachim's view eventually starts to develop in philosophy, which severs itself from the tradition precisely as something that goes beyond, through free thinking, right, the givenness of the church's form in history. And so I think that's one of the elements that creates this severance amongst others. So William of Ockham and nominalism, but you have Joachim of Fiore and spiritualism, which really creates a kind of secular space where the church kind of becomes the secular world as opposed to the world being converted by the church. And you saw a lot of this in the 20th century. After the Second Vatican Council, there was a massive crisis in the Catholic Church, and this is actually what prompted de Lubac to write his last book. It's a 2-volume book called the spiritual posterity of Joachim of Fiore. So that would be one thing, but if I'm talking too much, please cut me off. But to go back to the
no, no.
Renaissance,
I just thought, yeah, I want
yeah,
to. That's really good because the Renaissance, because there's an element as well that Taylor talks about, which is like the Reformation spirit that starts within the church itself, where there's an emphasis on trying to raise common people up to higher levels of practice, like the
yes,
getting rid of the kind of multi-speed Christianity where it was like
yeah,
everybody can kind of do different things. It was like, no, we all need
yeah,
to like level up and get, to sainthood. So there was more of an emphasis on individual progress in some sense within this, which seems very
absolutely,
connected to what you're saying of thinking about people as as each going to be, I don't know, vessels of the Holy Spirit. And then modernity, I
Yeah.
suppose, just takes that out, and we just become buffered selves and individuals that are exempt from spirits in some sense. But yeah,
Yep.
that Renaissance, what was it that Lubac saw in the Renaissance that kind of
Yeah.
began? Because Renaissance is very individualistic. That is the interesting thing. The great artist, the genius of the
Yeah.
artist, in a way that's very modern, I would say. Like it's really
Yeah.
not. That's the kind.
And
And for me as an atheist, my history used to start at the Renaissance. There was like everything before
yeah.
that was just like blacked out.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, the
Yeah.
Renaissance. That was when stuff actually started happening.
Yeah, no, and one thing that I appreciate about a lot of these thinkers like de Lubac, and we'll talk about hopefully Ratzinger and of course Balthasar and many others, is that they're
Mm.
very good in their criticisms because they affirm the aspects that ought to be incorporated in each period, even if it was a tumultuous, intellectually speaking, period that created problems. They're able to move beyond those problems while assimilating those aspects that ought to be assimilated. So in the Renaissance, I do think there's a lot of good, but you're right. I also think it created some serious problems. De Lubac, so I don't know how I could tell the story without starting with Blondel, honestly. So maybe, it's funny, when
Cool.
we were in Rome, I checked my phone and I got a notification that said that Pope Leo is going to be declaring John Henry Newman a doctor of the church, which just made my day. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely love John Henry Newman. But John Henry Newman was a 19th century theologian. Of course, some people know his story, but he was an Anglican at first, trying to find a via media, middle way between Roman Catholicism and like low church Protestantism. He wanted a kind of patristic Protestantism that was faithful to the tradition. And eventually he realized that he couldn't do that. And so he became Catholic, right? But he really is a kind of I call it a proto-ressourcement theologian. So ressourcement is a term in Catholic theology that refers to a movement, a group of theologians, but it's not as black and white as I'm making it out to sound. Some theologians can be categorized this way, some can't. Some are like on the fence. But there's a kind of movement, and especially in France, but also in Germany in the 20th century, that wants to go back to a heavier emphasis on the fathers of the church, so as to read the medievals in light of the fathers, as opposed to reading the medievals in light of subsequent, more modern commentaries on the medievals. And
Mm.
I'm bringing this up because Newman was, because he was Anglican and not Roman Catholic, was very much shaped by the fathers. And then him becoming Roman Catholic, you see this way of thinking in Newman where he's actually responding to modern philosophical objections and concerns with the fathers. And this proved to be so effective, and he writes so well, and he's so insightful that he ends up influencing massively a whole generation of theologians the next century. So I think things start with Newman when it comes to the Catholic response. And
Okay.
I promise you this is tied to the Renaissance. But
No,
then
I'm following you, man. That makes sense.
okay, yeah. So Pope Leo the 13th, so not our Leo right now, but Pope Leo the 13th, saw that things were changing. He's known for his famous encyclical letter, Rerum Novarum, which means on new things, right? And here we have the Industrial Revolution, right? The rise of these economic ideologies such as capitalism and communism, things like that. And Leo is trying to articulate a Catholic social teaching response to the effects of modernity on economics, labor, and human dignity, right? So there's like, tectonic plates are moving here. And Leo, who, by the way, described Newman as my cardinal, right? So Newman was made a cardinal, and Leo described him as my cardinal. So there was a predilection there. But before Leo wrote Rerum Novarum, a few years before that, he wrote this encyclical called Aeterni Patris, the Eternal Father. And it's actually an encyclical, and it's a bit unclear what he meant by this. It's an encyclical on the revival, and he called it of Christian philosophy. Right away, to a philosopher, that should be an alarm bell. what does the Pope here mean by Christian philosophy? Isn't philosophy something distinct from theology? So how could philosophy be Christian? Right? So then the questions of, is philosophy neutral, right? Is philosophy something that is co-opted? Is it something that has a
Mm.
relationship of submission with theology? Or ought it be free from the tyranny of theology? You see how this is actually tied to all of the modern questions, right? Of church, state,
Yeah.
freedom, secularism, everything. And so my point is that this starts a massive debate in Catholic theology that finds a culminating point in the 20th century between several French philosophers, actually. But Maurice Blondel is the first guy on the scene. And he actually wants to argue that philosophy is Catholic. So he doesn't like the word Christian, but for him, philosophy is Catholic.
Mhm.
And the way he gets to this is very interesting. Blondel is living in France in the late 1800s, and this is really a fascinating story just in itself. But in France,
Mhm.
church and state are not just separated, but at odds with each other, right? Almost like opposed to each other. And so is philosophy and theology. So is the education system in France, right? Like there's Catholic schools, and then there's state schools, and in the university level as well. And so the autonomy of philosophy was something that was a kind of sine qua non of operating in secular universities. And so Blondel actually decided, even though he was a devout Catholic, raised in a devout Catholic family, he decided to go study philosophy in a state university, right? And what he did is, and at the time, Spinoza and Leibniz were very big in France, right? As well as Hegel. But for some reason, Spinoza was really big in France at the time. What Blondel does is he studies all of modern philosophy from within, so to speak, behind enemy lines. He kind of calls it that way in some of his writings, right? But what he
Mm.
does is really fascinating because he is, in one sense, an apologist. He wants philosophy to be enriched by the church. He wants this division to be over, and for philosophy and theology, church and state, and Catholic culture and the French people to come back together, right after the devastations of the revolution. And what he does is he develops a method, a twofold method. One is called a method of immanence, and the other is called a method of insufficiency. The method of immanence is so there's actually a third method, which he calls the method of charity. So the method of immanence is beginning on the terms of modern philosophy. But that method is followed by the method of insufficiency, where on those very terms, he establishes modern philosophy's own insufficiency, right? Its own, basically the fact that its autonomy is not real, that we've been lying to ourselves, us modern philosophers. And the third one should have been the first one, the method of charity, which is actually listen to these people. Don't just write them off like he thought some other theologians were doing, right? So through this threefold method, Blondel develops a philosophy of, he calls it action. He begins with action. And what he does is he attempts, through an analysis of the human will and of our actions in everyday life, to show how there's something within us that aspires for something that philosophy and the immanent world cannot deliver, right? And so he develops, through this insufficiency of modern philosophy, an opening to the transcendent. So it's almost like someone going behind enemy lines and killing everybody in the bunker and putting the flag up and having the enemy come, the good guys conquer the territory, so to speak. But even that analogy is a bit
Yeah.
too confrontational, because what he's doing is actually he's going to be advocating for the integrity and to a certain extent the autonomy of philosophy, but it's a relative autonomy within a higher order of the transcendent. And that the problem is really cutting
Mm.
off philosophy from theology, the immanent from the transcendent, which actually creates a crisis and makes philosophy less philosophical, makes reason less reasonable, and all these kinds of things. So this is Blondel's project in France. And this strongly influences Henry de Lubac, a Jesuit who was born in the late 1800s. fought in World War I, had a head wound from the war that gave him migraines for the rest of his life. And he went on to write about so many different things that are absolutely fascinating, but mainly about the relationship between the natural world and the supernatural. And he makes sure to qualify the supernatural as an adjective, not as a noun, right? He doesn't want to juxtapose the natural and the supernatural as if you have nature and supernature, because when you juxtapose things, you're
Mm.
putting them in the same order and making them competitive. He wants the supernatural to be truly transcendent and therefore able to make itself immanent in a non-competitive way. So de Lubac basically asks the question, are the current Catholic theologians writing about the relationship between nature and grace, right? And these theologians are all Thomists. They're following St. Thomas Aquinas. His question is, are they actually reading St. Thomas Aquinas correctly? Because they tend to juxtapose the two orders of nature and grace in what he's going to call an extrinsicist way. One way I like to put it is like a Lego way. I add two Legos together, but I presuppose their initial disparity, right? And so a competitive framework
Hmm.
develops. So de Lubac asks that question. Then he reads St. Thomas in his historical context and comes to the conclusion that St. Thomas never actually taught that. Now, this is massively debated in some circles of the internet, but mostly in academic journals. So we can't do it justice here. But de Lubac starts to research this, and in the Renaissance, he makes a discovery. He thinks that basically what happened is that Thomas Cajetan, a commentator on St. Thomas, actually separates the orders of nature and the order of nature and the order of grace. And to prove this, he points to a thinker that came before Cajetan called Denis the Carthusian. And Denis the Carthusian argued for a particular position against Thomas Aquinas. So here's Denis's position. Denis basically said that we do not have a natural desire from within nature for a supernatural end, which is something that transcends nature. Because according to Aristotle, Denis says, right, anytime a creature has an end, it must have the proportionate powers to reach that end. And so therefore, because grace is something freely given, we have to be given an extra desire for the supernatural. And what that does is it severs the orders of nature and the order of grace, where we have a natural ultimate end and then a supernatural ultimate end, and both these ends are stacked on top. Now, that creates such a division, right, that you have almost the radical autonomy of nature, right? And then the supernatural becomes Disneyland, right? It becomes a nice added thing that you actually don't really need, right? And so what's interesting is that Cajetan takes Denis's position and claims it's Aquinas's. And then a whole line of commentary from Cajetan assumes that this is Aquinas's position. And therefore, in Catholic theology, now this is the interesting thing here, is not Catholic tradition, because
Hmm.
the magisterial teachings, right, the teachings from councils, and even in people like Dominic de Soto and even Robert Bellarmine, they don't follow Cajetan on this. De Soto is before Cajetan. But the point, though, is that within a strand of Catholic theology, there is a kind of extrinsicism between the immanent and the transcendent, the nature-grace relationship, which mirrors what happens in the Renaissance with the rising humanism, right, and the rise of a retrieval of the Greeks in a kind of, naturalness, right, a kind of autonomy of nature. What's interesting is that Cajetan, not only is he writing this way and interpreting Thomas as if Thomas is saying what Denis, the Carthusian, was saying, but he's also very interested in the humanism of his day in the Renaissance and trying to negotiate with the humanism of his day. So de Lubac concludes that there is a break here, an interpretation that severs the natural and the supernatural.
Mm.
And then de Lubac spends a lot of time reading Blondel, and Blondel is showing him how there's an insufficiency in nature, that for it to be integral, right, and have a consistency of its own, therefore relative autonomy, it must be in an intrinsic relationship to the supernatural, not an extrinsic one. So, in other words, like, these theologians are drilling down to see where the intellectual misstep was so as to reestablish the proper
Mm.
perspective and what the tradition actually says. And hopefully this will then kind of, through the church's missionary work, right, and reform, and this is what the Second Vatican Council was in large part about, right? It was meant to kind of recover ressourcement, right, the tradition, and then aggiornamento, I'm saying it wrong, the Italian word, to update, right? So you recover the tradition in order to respond in a new way to the modern problems. This is part, I mean, and this is part of the Catholic response, right? To kind of bring back together the secular and the religious, to speak inadequately. So I'll stop there for now. But what do you think?
That is so interesting, man. So, like, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of arguing that the mistake that starts that the conflict, in a sense, in modernity between almost two worlds is this nature supernature misinterpretation of Aquinas's nature supernature distinction,
Yes.
that creates two worlds in a sense, one that's
Yes.
immanent, one that's transcendent, and then the transcendent one becomes increasingly associated with probably things that are like thought of as fanciful or whatever. And so naturally, when you have those two things, some group of people is going to be like, we're just going to choose this one when they're juxtaposed to
Exactly.
each other in some way. And the naturalist, the materialist, the nominalist, the Enlightenment really seems to start to argue that it's just the natural world. The supernatural world isn't real. Um, it's a fake world. And then there's an element there which Taylor talks
You
about, which
nailed
is
it.
the
Yeah.
maturity aspect. Like, a big part of the modern argument, I think, is that we need to be grown up and courageous enough to accept that this is all there is, to accept that there
Correct.
is no supernature. There's only what immediate material immanent reality, in a sense, and that's part of being like a virtuous person in some sense. So
Yeah.
am I correct in saying that that's the nature
Yeah. You
supernature is
absolutely.
the thing you're picking out? Okay.
Yes, and I think it's undervalued how important this particular question is. The effect of separating nature and grace in the way in which they're separated,
Mm.
I think, is intimately tied uh, and I don't want to just blame this strand of theology. I think there are Siamese twins involved here. There's similar things going on in philosophy, probably actually, worse than what's happening in theology, because these theologians believed in the supernatural. They believed in conversion and in preaching and in God and in the mythos and the ethics and then the metaphysics. They were all Catholic, right? But and
Mm.
so I just want to say that it's part of the question, and I think that understanding that can help us approach this extrinsicism, as de Lubac calls it, in a reformed, more intrinsic perspective that will actually be more effective in evangelizing and bringing back, philosophy and secular people to the church, if that makes sense. Yeah, but you absolutely nailed it. Yeah.
Okay, and because there's a bunch of other contradictions as well in modernity that kind of come up, things like the mind-body problem, subject-object relationship. Like, we
Yeah.
get split between like objective things and subjective agents, and then there's Kant kind of makes that even worse, where he's got the thing in itself and our
Yeah.
perception of the thing. He creates this like epistemological
Noumenal and
dualism,
phenomenal.
and
Yeah.
noumenal, and then you have material and immaterial, and like all
Mhm.
these problematic categories that just become split more, like that could be quite rooted in, to be honest, this fundamental split of losing a kind of an immanentizing of reality that then
Yes.
becomes like impossible to explain ourselves, our reality.
Yeah.
It's almost like, yeah, they're the only tools, for a poor workman that only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we start
Yeah.
just kind of whacking away with and
Yeah.
then obviously
Yeah.
then it becomes very complicated and very confusing. And like, so yeah, you think the
Yeah.
second council then was trying to sort out this kind of first mistake or first
Well, so
misinterpretation?
so the Second Vatican Council is the product of its own, and I won't make this long, I promise, but its own history, right? Which is that
No, no,
de
worthwhile.
Lubac Blondel is the one that really starts to question the narrative on nature and grace. But he's a philosopher, right? He's getting flack from secular philosophers, but as well as from theologians. De Lubac as a priest doing theology and mining the tradition. I mean, de Lubac, because of his head wound, spent a lot of time in bed. I think like 2 years sick. He was sick for like 2 years. So he just went through the entire collection of means translations of the church fathers, right, east and west. So de Lubac's knowledge of the tradition is one of the most incredible I've ever come across. But de Lubac really starts the ball rolling on this, and he kind of gets in trouble. He gets shut down. There's some conflict. He's actually silenced for something like 10 or 15 years, where he's not allowed to teach anymore.
Wow.
He's not allowed to publish anymore. But he gets rehabilitated. And then the Second Vatican Council gets called in 1950. In 1960, it's announced that there's going to be a council. In 1962, the council opens. De Lubac is appointed by the new pope at the time, John the 23rd, as an expert for the drafting of the documents. And so de Lubac and other people influenced by de Lubac, such as Ratzinger from Germany, and people like in the whole ressourcement movement in France, like what's his name? Jean Danielou is another one influenced by him. You have Yves Congar, who's influenced by Blondel a lot. And so you have a lot of these theologians who are coming out of this ressourcement movement. They're all influenced by Blondel, and they're present at the council, and they're helping the bishops write these documents. But they're not the only ones. You also have some more kind of neo-scholastic theologians doing theology in line with the commentaries, the modern commentaries on Thomas. And so the council, kind of, as all councils are, becomes a text that kind of seeks to reach agreeable compromise between all parties. But the ressourcement language and emphasis, the biblical revival, the patristic revival, really does come out in the forefront in the text of the council. And so a lot of work is done in areas that are more strictly theological and of less relevance to philosophy, such as like ecclesiology, based on its relation to the church's relationship to the Eucharist, right? Sacramental theology and its connection to the social aspect of human nature. But the point, though, ultimately is that the council tries to give a new reformed vision to the church. And this new vision is a kind of reconfiguration of all of the truths of theology around the central truth of Christ, which opens up to the Trinitarian logic of reality. Through Christ, we kind of come to know the Trinity, but what we know in the Trinity through Christ affects all the other mysteries. And so, long story short is that, yes, through this reform, by kind of all these divisions that you talked about, right? Immanent, transcendent, nature, grace, objective, subjective, all of these in the text of the council seem to be gone behind of, and Christ is brought forward as a synthesis of intrinsic unity of all these dichotomies, and Christ is kind of injected as a medicine in all these divisions to basically overcome them in a way that's not like ad hoc, like putting things back together like Lego pieces, but like going back to the tradition and injecting that unity of the mystery into modernity to heal all the divisions through Christ. That's the vision of the council. And what I love seeing right now is that that's also the vision of the current pope. He talks about unity, and he's always talking about Christ and how Christ, with unity without Christ is not possible. But I don't know if that answers your question. I went on a rant there, but yeah. So
no, that does. Well, it gives me the lay of the land in terms of like what the Second Council was trying to do and like how that makes sense. I'm still a little bit sketchy on how, because like, okay, if you bring Christ into, I mean, how does he? Because like, it seems like even stuff like the mind-body problem, like that Descartes brings in because of his immaterial mind and material body, that is still resolved in science. It's like you either go for reductive physicalism, where it's like mental processes just are brain processes. Some have a non-reductive physicalism, but it's kind of hard to explain how that works, and like we get stuck. I mean, do you think like is the answer then to go to the tradition and be like, how was this before all of this stuff happened, or like does it have to be like all of these kind of things to be refolded in some way, or does it like explicitly deal with that? Sorry, it's a bit of a all over the place question.
No. Yeah. So a lot of what I was kind of talking about when it comes to the council and some of these theologians is very theological, right? But what are the implications for the crisis of modernity, for the work of metaphysics and stuff like that? This is when post-conciliar theologians start to step in, like Balthasar, even though he was present before the council and writing already. Balthasar writes most prolifically after the council, and I think that basically what we're talking about is overcoming these dualisms, right? So Ratzinger is another one who writes a lot after the council. Ratzinger is not a philosopher; he's a theologian, but he's doing philosophy, of course, all the time. But Ratzinger talks about what you were talking about, this materialism, and then this kind of reaction to it in idealism, and he wants to overcome these two things. The same thing will happen in Balthasar with like objectivism and like subjectivism, right? And the way they overcome them is, I think sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, they're drawing on Maurice Blondel. Balthasar very explicitly. Balthasar is a huge proponent of Blondel. Ratzinger, I think, through others, is drawing from Blondel, not directly. But the way Blondel does it is he talks about, right, notional things, right, and then real things. So like knowing things notionally and knowing things really. That's why he focuses on action, right? When we act and live, we come into contact with things. But when we know things, our knowledge is limited, and so we can't fully grasp them. And by going to action, he's able to kind of synthesize the idealism and the kind of reduced realism in a middle ground that opens up to both. Ratzinger does this by talking about freedom as the middle ground, which is actually the unity prior to the division between materialism and idealism. He speaks of freedom. So I think they want to get back to a philosophy that is a realist philosophy, that is not materialism, but a lot more like Plato, basically, right? So Plato's idea of levels of reality, right? And participation through our, and so it's very existential, right? So they're going back to St. Thomas and they're reading him through his idea of existence, right? The real distinction between essence and existence, right? And so they're really trying to be grounded in something that doesn't fall into these two different pitfalls of reducing everything to ideas or reducing everything to the empirical. But they say that you have reality and you can think about it, right? And you can experience it, but it's the spectrum of participation that we can enter in more deeply, like get out of the cave, right? And then really be in communion with the ultimate, with the good. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that helps, but
no,
one
that
more thing
really does, and that
okay,
fantastic.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry,
I was going to say
it's
there's a little bit of a lag. Yeah, but I was just going to say that basically, they're really trying to get behind these dichotomies, and the way they do that is by going back and reading Plato, right, Aristotle to an extent, Thomas, Bonaventure, Chrysostom, Maximus, right, and this is their project, and they're not seeing, of course, these modern objective, subjective, noumenal, phenomenal, idealist, materialist. They're obviously not seeing any of that because what they are seeing is just deeper. It's just better, right? And what we're seeing in modern philosophy and to an extent in modern theology is a kind of narrowing, a kind of thinking that it's competitive. You have to have something that's either idealist or either materialist. You can't think of a sense of reality that is gradated, mediated, and participatory, right? And just deeper, where the idea and the real are facets of being, basically. So that's kind of what they do. Yeah.
Yes. Man, like that's so good, and it almost had that experience in real time in some sense, like reading Plato and DC Schindler after having been trained in mostly modern philosophy. Of just been like, oh yeah, all of these dualisms completely dissolve when they're actually seen properly. But I think part of the problem is it's almost like a big tent approach. It's like you can't do them one at a time. In some sense, it's like you have to get the whole thing up, like the whole metaphysics, like Plato's metaphysics requires the good, Christian
Mm-hmm.
metaphysics requires God, and then you can have this leveled ontology. So like if they won't accept God, it's like you're actually left with a very limited ontology immediately anyway. Like you
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
it's like these choice points of like, if you choose no God, you're just going to go this complete one way. If you accept God as the presupposition or initial metaphysical assumption, it's like you can go the
Yeah.
other way. But it's like we're trapped in this weird bind where it's like we can't accept the assumption, so you just get this like really
Mm-hmm.
deluded, like all over the
Yeah.
place kind of thing that's like, you
Yeah.
know, inevitable in some sense. And I think Kant like tries to undo that, but then
Yeah.
obviously traps us within our own kind of head. But he, like, Kant should be Plato. Like his whole thing is
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Like he recognizes the role of knowledge in structuring reality and structuring our perception, and so it's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, it's not all just out there in a mind independent reality. The
Yeah.
subjective is in the objective is in the subjective in some way. And I was like, yeah, that's literally Plato, like the forms, and then through the forms
Yes.
is a cause of the forms. God, you can climb
Yeah.
that. It's like, but he just doesn't. Yeah, doesn't get there in some sense.
And one of the problems in some kind of niche strands of Catholic theology is that there's a pitting of Plato against Aquinas, because Aquinas is depicted as merely a kind of rubber stamper of Aristotle, right? Which is just not the case. You
Yeah,
have people like Etienne Gilson in France, Joseph Pieper in Germany, and more recently Norris Clark in America, and Ferdinand Ulrich. And I'd love to talk about him for just a second, but Ferdinand Ulrich, these guys are
yeah,
drawing out the Neoplatonic, the participatory, the straight up Platonic influences, right, through Dionysius and Augustine and all. There is so much more in
mm,
Thomas that is much more in line with Plato than Aristotle, actually, right? And that's something that these thinkers
yeah,
kind of try to bring out and use that to respond to some of these modern thinkers like Heidegger and Hegel, especially. But one thing I wanted to focus on is, I think Maurice Blondel is not focused on enough. His achievement is massive. I just recently finished
mm,
a intellectual biography of him by an author called Oliva Blanchette. Um, and
uh-huh,
in the biography, Blanchette kind of talks about his untranslated later in life trilogy on thought, action, and being, or actually thought, being, and action. He finishes on action. And Blondel,
yeah,
again, with his method of immanence, with his method of insufficiency, and his method of charity, what he's doing is he's drawing out how, if we look at our thought, right, the different forms of thoughts, its gradated structure in the universe. He doesn't think thought is merely a human thing, right? He talks about the thought
mm,
structure of plants and of minerals and of energy and things like that. But he looks at the universe through the lens of thought, right? And and basically a kind of Platonic participatory structure of thought seeking to think itself, and how an ultimate thought thinking itself, and here he agrees with Aristotle, right, would be God, right? But he thinks that Aristotle kind of stops there, and so he turns to being, right? And here he's more with Plato, and he talks about being in, through, and of itself. And he says there's a gradated participatory structure in being that culminates in the ultimate being in, through, and of itself. And then he turns to action, and he says, well, action, same thing. Action is a mode of actualization that is engaged with other things in a relational way. So there must be a kind of ultimate pure acting, right? That and he concludes by turning to this thought thinking itself, this being in, of, and through itself, right? And he looks at action as pure action, and he says these only work together as different facets of this transcendent reality if we posit three poles within this ultimate unity, right? And so he starts to hint at a kind of Trinitarian structure of ultimate being, and develops an ontology of relation, right? And all this from within philosophy. He's not even
mm,
yet bursting up, because he says, I can't burst out of philosophy and bring in theology. That would violate the proper distinction between both. But notice how he is very much presupposing the supernatural order within which he's doing autonomously his philosophy, within that order, not
yeah,
without it, right? And what's interesting is that
Mm.
Then comes later after Blondel. This philosopher died very recently, I think 2020 or 2022. Um, Ferdinand Ulrich in Germany, right? And Ulrich straight up uses the data of theology as a guide to, while remaining purely within philosophy, right? To basically unpack various dimensions and move philosophy forward through a ontology of gift, an ontology of relation, of being as always being gift, and of being reception, and of being return, and of being a fruitful union, right? And Ulrich develops this through a metaphysics of creation, all this stuff. So Blondel and Ulrich, to me, are the big heavy hitters. Balthasar called Blondel the greatest philosopher in modern times. I mean, that's quite a compliment.
Wow.
And Balthasar said about
Yeah.
Ulrich that Ulrich finally definitively overcomes the dualism between philosophy and theology. So I think these are two top dogs, basically, right? And
Hmm.
I think that they
Definitely.
understand what comes after for the development of philosophy. It has to be a return, analogical return to its unity with theology, the natural with the supernatural, revelation with reason, right? A reintegration of Christendom
Yeah.
through a Christocentric, view of an ontology of relation, of gift, right, of exchange in the Trinity. So the conclusion of all this is that if we want to think about ontology properly and kind of restore its place in philosophy, I think we have to think in a relational Trinitarian way. But I'll shut up now. Yeah.
Man, that was some answer. Yeah, you've got it. It brings it together in a way. And I think yeah, because theology, it always seemed to me anyway with Plato that like the result of philosophy practiced properly was theology in some sense. Like the
Yeah.
end,
Yeah.
like if you pursued philosophy to its end, you'd hit theology. Like that was Plato's, like the
Yeah.
beholding of the good is just, essentially the experience of God, of
Yeah.
recognizing that there is this ultimate reality that is the source of everything and that we are in relationship to it,
Yeah.
and that it's the source of our value and our reality, and that experience in a way was transformative and was like the basis of becoming the type of person that could be a functioning, like, well, philosopher king in his
Yeah.
estimation, like a person who was capable of leading other people and of organizing things and should be entrusted with
Yeah.
responsibility, was the
Yeah.
basis of that. So like it makes, yeah. And do you think we just haven't caught up to these thinkers? Like they haven't had their full effect yet. Like
I'm
they've
not
they've done the
full.
job
Yeah.
in a sense, but it's like we haven't, it hasn't
Yeah.
penetrated into the mainstream consciousness.
Yeah. I'm not fully sure, but my gut reaction is to say yes. I mean,
Hmm.
I've been kind of looking around. I'm trying to find some good authors. Of course, I tend to swim in theological circles more than philosophical ones. Although Blondel was
Hmm.
insistent on saying that he was not a theologian, he was a philosopher. That was very important to him. But I do think that people
Hmm.
like Ulrich and Blondel uh, have articulated something that has not yet trickled down, not just in academia, because
Hmm.
as you know, I mean, just look at Sartre or Kant, right? Philosophy trickles down into the way we live our lives at the regular
Foucault is the
layperson
most
level.
cited academic of all time, and
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, right. So I think that,
like, what
yeah,
the
we're not
hell?
there yet, but these are the sources from which the trickle, I hope, comes, right? So, yeah. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
if people engage with them more, and I guess you have thinkers like DC Schindler as well, who are obviously very inspired by these guys. I know he talks about Balthasar a
Yes.
lot, and
Yeah.
Blondel,
And
and
Ulrich, he wrote a whole book on Ulrich.
bring
Yeah.
that and Ulrich.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and bring that forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean,
there's
any final thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, just to say that uh, obviously these would be a different video, but there's questions like that are raised by modern science. I mean, we talked about last time the heliocentric shift, the discovery of evolutionary biology,
Yeah.
things like that, right? And there's also some of
Yep.
these theologians, like Ratzinger especially, tackling these questions of the relationship between evolution and cosmology and our ontology, right? And Blondel too
Yes.
actually does a lot on that. And another question, for
Hmm.
example, because we're talking about the relationship between the church, culture, and philosophy, would be biblical exegesis, right? Ratzinger speaks of incorporating some of its historical critical aspects, but also being able to develop a criticism of the criticism, right? Using the tools to deepen the rationality of what claims to be reason while cutting
Hmm.
itself off from faith, right? And then the church-state relationship and the question of freedom of religion. How do we think that through, right? And the relationship between power and authority. Schindler is writing about that. And Ratzinger writes a lot about religious pluralism. What do we do in a more globalized society? These thinkers are writing and thinking about these things, have wrote and thought about these things.
Hmm.
Many of them have died, but people are still continuing it. But I do think there was a generation of giants that came
Yeah.
recently and have gone that we need to be inspired by
Hmm.
to continue that work. So maybe I'll end it with that. Yeah.
Yeah. The man, great point. And also putting them in dialogue, I suppose, with people, because if it just stays in theology in some sense, it
Yeah.
probably wouldn't reach the people that it really needs to reach in a way. Like, I think
Yeah.
part of the internet as well is encouraging these interdisciplinary discussions. Like, and I think it's just
Yeah.
people hear the heliocentric thing, they hear evolution, they hear it's all been explained, and they never hear
Yeah.
a contrary opinion on that.
Yeah.
Like, it's,
Yeah.
whereas there's so many questions and so much of that stuff. I also think as now, I think we're coming to the end of science. It's a very bold
Yeah.
claim, probably
Yeah.
not entirely, but like a lot
Yeah.
of the people, I mean, scientists are saying this, like I'm not the only one. Sabine Hossenfeld or something, where it's like there was only going to be so much progress made by studying the natural universe that we'd
Yeah.
figure these things out, and
Yeah.
and at some point that was going to kind of run, it was going
Yeah.
to slow down at least, like, because we've made incredible progress. I think as that
Yeah.
slows down, people will be more open to considering the foundations of these things that are,
Metaphysics,
it's like,
theology. Yep.
you know,
Yep.
metaphysics, theology,
Yeah.
epistemology, like
Yeah.
those more fundamental questions. So yeah, as John Vervaeke said,
Yeah.
theology is the subject of the future.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. And when I talk to you, I always love it. I mean, we could go on for probably hours, you know. So, yeah.
Yeah,
I hope
yeah,
my
definitely,
babble
man.
made
Let's keep
some
it
sense.
going.
Yeah. Yeah.
It totally did, man. And you've given me, oh man, I got to read Blondel. If you had a recommendation for
You
where to start with
Yeah,
Blondel, what would you, what's the
I would say
go-to?
start with Blanchette's biography, because it's not just a biography.
Really? Okay.
It's a book of philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's warning. It's massive. It's like 800 pages.
Okay.
So, but it's worth your
Fantastic.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like it, man. It really, really does. So, yeah, it's bringing a lot
Yeah.
together. I'll check it out.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Um, awesome. Thanks very much, Tom. And people can find you. I'll include your YouTube, the Logos Project, anywhere else you'd like them to go.
No, honestly, just the YouTube channel. I do have a blog, but I don't use it as much anymore. So I would just point them to the YouTube channel. Yeah.
Awesome. Will do, man. Thanks again.
Peace.